Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners, and welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm, and I will be your host. So today, I'm joined with Riggs Eckelberry. How you doing today, Riggs?
You know, it's a beautiful day. Florida's finally cooled down, so it feels like a European spring.
Nice. Who's rubbing it in for the New Englander that's seeing 40-degree weather? So thank you, Riggs. Appreciate it.
Well, I'm a big skier, so I like the colder the better.
Nice. Well, it's definitely cold. So so let's just dive right in. So Riggs, tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I was a corporate brat as a child. My dad was running Procter and Gamble branches throughout first Canada, then the Caribbean, and then Europe. So I'm basically homeless, which is good and bad because I don't have a hometown flavor to my life. But at the same time, I think I have a more global view of things. And these days, everything relates to everything else, right? So it's important to know, kind of get perspective.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's we live in a world where our country, most people in this country don't realize that there are countries outside of the U.S. So
To this day, I don't think they even know where Ukraine is, but that's a different podcast. But no, I grew up as a sort of son of an American businessman in Europe, in the 50s and 60s, which means that we were upper class on a middle class salary, given what was going on over there. And I got to see how Europe really, recovered and prospered. Then I was sent off to school in the States because my dad really wanted to Americanize me. So, which happened to my detriment. And then I got excited about working in the online space after high school, did that for about a dozen years, and finally landed in New York in the 80s, enthralled by technology. And I felt that, and to this day, I feel that technology is the key to solving our problems, as well as being the potential, thing that'll bury us all. But it has the potential to really solve all our problems. And that's what I got excited about. And I've been doing that ever since.
yeah, technology is fascinating because I remember when the internet boom was happening, and everyone said, "Oh, it'll be great. Everything will be done for us, and we can work fewer hours in the day." And what happened? We're working more hours, and we're more efficient. That's all that really happened. The Europeans haven't really taken that as much, which is good. But yeah, what did you like most about Europe, by the way?
Well, first of all, of course, there's very few things that are as young as America over there. So different place. For example, even though we lived more years in Brussels than Paris, I to this day am far more in love with Paris because it has so much going on culturally, whereas Brussels is an overgrown suburb, basically. And what I enjoy, frankly, is all the languages, right? I love getting into other people's languages. And with that comes the culture. You start speaking French to someone, you are being French, you're channeling that. And of course, it's so much of it is so beautiful. I mean, the French countryside blows me away. But you go to Italy and the Cinque Terre, it's just stunning over there. So the one big problem they have over there, which we didn't have when I was growing up, is that everybody's getting old. There's not enough birth rate. Italy literally went 3 months without a single birth in the entire country recently.
Wow.
So when I was growing up, my mom had an allowance from the French government for having more kids because they were trying to, regenerate all the from the war. They're trying to regenerate people. And then they kind of slacked off on that. And now a little too late. So a place like Italy are turning into a museum. It's really terrible. So that's where we might not like immigration, but we have to have people. And America's doing okay with that.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I hadn't heard of that about Italy. 3 months without a single birth. Forget what country it was. It was Norway, Finland, where they were advertising people to go take an hour off from work so they can go have more kids. I was like, really? I can go home for an hour and go have kids?
And what is it? What does that entail? Oh, I might even like that. Hey,
Yeah, I thought it was hilarious. I forget when it was. Maybe it was like 10 years ago. They had this campaign. I was like, that's just hilarious. Like, how could you not poke fun at this? Like, it's great. But
well, the issue really is that, and Peter Zeihan, who I follow very closely, talks about this. He says in a developed society, children are a burden, right? So financially, you're paying all these bills. People go, I can't afford a kid. Whereas poor people, they afford them all the time, right? So how is it that poor people can have strings of kids and rich people can't afford them because obviously they have to get all the boarding school, the private school stuff. They have to spend all this money on the kid. When all the kid wants is love and a basic education, right?
right. Well, there's also incentives for poor people to have kids too. I mean, like dirt poor people who are on welfare, they get paid more per child. So there's some incentives there too, which probably don't
That's
help.
true.
But what it is interesting though, because you think about like I think about conversations I've had with people, and there certainly are people who have like big families because they came from big families, they want big families, but nowadays it's kind of more the exception. Most of the people I talk to, like I've talked to a lot of people who've decided not to have kids,
Yeah.
and they've done it in a very thoughtful manner. So it's not like they just couldn't have kids or just don't like kids. It was like, no, we had this conversation. We decided we just felt like we only had one child or we had no children. Like some people decided one kid was the thoughtful approach, and I was like, you're the type of people you should have five because you're so thoughtful about your upbringing your child. Like you should be having more, but it's the reverse. And it kind of brings up this conversation about demographics, right? I mean, it's going on in Europe right now, right? They're fighting this, and then they're having immigrations, but now they have immigration problems because they're trying to just bring in anybody, and then they've got other problems that they're facing too. So I don't know. I don't know what the solution is. Yeah, have you thought about that at all? Or
Well, America has done we people come into the country and they generally assimilate better than Europe has had. Um, Even though there's Muslim communities in places like Minnesota, they still consider themselves American, right? Whereas in Europe, and I'm saying Muslim because that is the vast majority of the distinct populations in Europe. They consider themselves to be more Muslim than French or German or whatever. And I think that, and I don't think Europe has figured out how to assimilate. The melting pot concept really is an American, special American thing. And Europe doesn't function that way. Europe still thinks of itself as white. What can I say, right? White Judeo-Christian. And America, I think, has moved on beyond that. And for example, I love the fact that we have so many Latinos in this country. They bring. There was a study once done of in LA public schools of these newly arrived immigrant kids, and they were uniformly more moral, more hardworking, more ethical. After 2 years, they were the same as everybody else, right?
that's very common, unfortunately. Second
But at least,
generation gets it tough.
but at least there's the many friends, Hispanic friends I have, they bring up their kids great. They set a great example. They have more kids, and that I would say the largest immigrant bloc in this country, I think, is Hispanic at this time, and it's a total asset in so many ways.
It's interesting because I think this has long been the case where immigrants to this country, the first generation, hardworking, they in many ways bring their culture with them, and sometimes within their own stick within their own communities because they're still speaking the language, but they're all hardworking. They're good family structure, and then like second generation, it breaks a little bit. Third generation, they're American and they're a mess like the rest of us. Like everything's out the window. They're Americanized, and it's like if only they could have kept those really strong parts of the family structure. And I guess we kind of disassociate them with that.
It's good and
Well,
bad. I mean, like as I say, Europe has the problem that they are not assimilating. So yeah, we're dumbing down our population, but that's not really the assimilation is not the reason. The reason we're dumbing it down is because we literally have a lot of education go downhill. That's a whole other podcast. But what it does bring to mind, obviously, is I again, so coming back to kind of the thread of my story, I started computerizing businesses in New York City in the 80s. For the very first time, they were coming off of paper ledgers into these networks, whatever it was, PCs, super micro computers, all that stuff. And it there's no question it transforms a company to get off of paper and start getting everything online. But truthfully, really, technology really only blew up for me when I encountered the internet, because now it was not about computers for computing, but computers for communication. And I fell in love with that. The first time I remember I played with a early browser, 94, I think it was. And literally you type in an address and boom, you're in the UK, and boom, you're in France, and boom. And I just thought that was so marvelous. And so I got to be part of that. I was involved with some early internet companies starting in 95, all the way to the dot-com crash. And then beyond that, had some liquidity events. And what I learned there was how to make disruption happen, because disruption is great, but it's kind of like first moving a locomotive. The wheels spin for a while, and then you get momentum. And so how do you do the breakout? And I love studying that and figuring out how to get, wide scale adoption of something. And it has a lot to do with, again, dumbing down the story, making it accessible, but also getting those first cohorts in at what Microsoft calls attachment, getting attachment, more and more people, being attached to something. And then pretty soon it's everybody. That's a great book, Inside the Tornado, that talks about that you have to overcome all these barriers, and then one day it just blows up and everybody wants it. And it's a fascinating technology life cycle.
Well, I think we're going to bring this into the topic of today. There's a good segue into the topic which we're going to talk about, which is water. So this is one of the things that I've read a lot about. I think the first time that I was interested in looking into it was Eckelberry, one of the subject matters of The Big Short. People talked about, he said, "Oh, what are you looking at now?" And he said, "Water." And I always found that fascinating because there was no easy way to invest in water at the time. And so I've kind of looked into it and realized that it's just a very interesting field that needs so much work, and yet at the same time, it's not on everybody's minds because people want to focus on AI and cryptocurrency and all this other stuff. So tell us a little bit about the water industry. Like what drew you to the water industry?
Well, as far as how I got into it, it was very simple. I was in this technology game, and in 2005, I helped bring a company onto the NASDAQ that was a software company. I was the number two, and like all number twos, I thought I could be a better number one. That's just how it is. The first mate thinks he can be better than the captain, and sure enough, I had an opportunity to become a CEO, but the VCs that wanted me to do it said, "Well, we're not doing tech anymore. We're doing green." And we started a company in the algae to biofuels industry, which was so much fun. And I got onto all kinds of mainstream media because, it was one of those, wow, I was called Algae Man. Stuart Varney called me, "I'll call you Algae Man," and it was a lot of fun. The problem is that fracking came along, crashed the price of crude, which was good for the rest of us, but it was terrible for algae. And we had to pivot. And we took an algae extraction process and turned it into a sewage extraction process. And suddenly we were in the water industry. And all of a sudden, I became invisible. Nobody cared. I was no longer on any shows. It's like, yeah, water, whatever, right? And that was the problem back in, around when we made the pivot around 2013, 2014. There was just a lack taken for granted. I remember meeting with the editor of Fast Company, who previously I would have pitched some cool tech thing, and she wanted nothing. Like, I don't want to know water, forget it. So that was number one. But the number two was that there's actually big problems in water. Now, Eckelberry did go on. The rest of the story there is he went on to try and get into water, and he gave up direct investment in water because it was too political, and turned to farming as an indirect use of water. And so what you have is this almost impregnable, temple called water, which is run by the municipalities, the utilities, which are very few of them are private. And those that are private, by the way, do a terrible job. You don't want to privatize a utility ever. And there's the big water companies, Veolia, American Water Works, Evacuate, and so forth. And that's it. And so as you say, investing in water is tough. You either buy municipal bonds or you invest in a big water company, but they're mammoth and they grow very slowly. And so that's why there's not much interest. What we realized, there was really a seminal research webinar that I experienced in 2016 by Lux Research about decentralization. And it said decentralized water is a thing. Why? Well, it turns out that we are running $100 billion a year behind, this will be by 2025, in needed infrastructure expense in the US alone. Now, $100 billion is still a fair amount of money. People are getting angry that $100 billion got sent to Ukraine. So it's a chunk of money, and yet that is missing every single year from the water budget. So that's why bad things start to happen. Flint, problems in the Appalachia area with the DuPont toxins, South Bend, where there a lot of manufacturing is a mess. There's all kinds of sort of canaries in a coal mine that really show that we have a problem. And it's not the fault of the utilities, it's that they're just underfunded. There was in Compton a few years ago, the water started running brown, and the people in Compton said, "Hey, what's up?" And the utility said, "Oh, it's perfectly safe. It's just magnesium," which is not a good answer. But turned out that the utility had not been getting its funds for 10 or 15 years from the local city council. And so they just didn't happen. Another example, and it was eventually handled by the LA Metro Water District, just absorbing Compton, and the problem kind of went away. But take a look at the Biden administration's $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that was early on in 2020, 2021, and 1/2000th of it was devoted to water. Like, water, everybody says it's the most important thing after air. Well, so why are you underfunding it? And I don't really understand the psychology of it. What I do know is that we had an attitude in the turn of the century, all the way post-war, of big central systems, big mammoth central systems. Well, today, I live in Pinellas County, Florida, and it's completely built out. Where are you going to put a sewage plant, even if you had the money? So the whole idea of centralized water treatment is no longer operative. It doesn't work anymore. Now, water sourcing, water coming from a utility, is still. I'm not advocating that people try and dig their own wells or become their own private source of water. I'm talking about treating the dirty water, which is what makes us all sick, right? So we're moving towards a decentralized model, and it's a good thing.
So I've got a bunch of topics I want to touch on here. So we talked about treatment, which is certainly one of them. How do you decentralize the treatment? Because in the past, it's just everything's gone to one place, gets treated and gets sent back. And of course, there's always the issue now that everybody's taking drugs, legal, prescription drugs, but now you've got that in the wastewater, and that comes back, and then that goes into the drinking water. So it's just there's a lot of challenges in here. So how do you handle the treatment problem in a decentralized way?
Well, it's done through we basically technology, scaling down technology. So a system that takes a couple acres in a utility needs to take up 300 square feet in a brewery, and so you have to downsize it. And we launched a company that is has very strong patents in the area of these modular water systems. It's called modular water systems, and it accomplishes that beautifully. You just it comes in on a semi, drop the container in place, plug in the water and electricity, and off you go. And that turns it more into a high-speed model versus the build-in-place concrete systems that people are accustomed to. So the technology is pretty much there. We're not the only player by any means, but we're excuse me, we're leading the space in terms of 60% of all our jobs with modular water are what's called basis of design, meaning that the client specified our technology and it can't be switched out. So we have a good angle on the proprietary water treatment at the point of use. So that's number one. Number two, of course, you need talent, engineers, and so forth. We have those. But number three comes back to the money. At some point, you run into people who don't have the capital. You're a brewery, you're making beer. You don't have $1 million for a water treatment system. So what do? Well, the new concept that's emerging, again, we're one of the players, is water as a service, where we simply replace the utility. You keep paying on the meter, but it's our machine on your premises. And we have investors who fund that. And it becomes a lot like oil well partnerships have been, which has been a very successful model.
So, sewage being one part, I know one of the parts in the West Coast is the lack of water in some ways. And, you don't hear about that in the East Coast so much, but in the West Coast, you certainly do. And I know there's a lot of states drawing from, was it the Colorado River? There's where people pull from. Yeah. And so how are people solving that challenge right now? Like, I'm just curious on what solutions are there to solve the lack of water problem.
Yeah, and by the way, there's a big problem with the Ogallala Aquifer in the Midwest. We've heard about the Mississippi running all the way down and making it very hard to move goods up and downstream. But the first, you always want to do the inexpensive solutions. People tell me, "Oh, Riggs, why don't we just have a bunch of desalination plants?" The problem with desal is it's very hard to permit. There was a project in Huntington Beach, California for a big desal plant, and after 10 years, it got canceled. Well, you don't want to, those investors really got screwed. It got canceled for valid reasons because it's not environmentally great. Desalination plants, the reject water is highly, highly concentrated. It's like the water in the Great Salt Lake, right? It's very, very thick with salt, and that hurts marine life and so forth. But the long story short is it's expensive and it's hard to do. Whereas, what if we recycled our water? Israel today recycles almost 90% of its water, whereas we recycle 1%. So it would seem to be an easy first thing. It's like, and the problem we have with our municipal system, which is another good reason to decentralize it, is that it's built on a one-way basis. We treat your water and we throw it away. It typically goes into the groundwater or whatever, or into the river. It typically does not come back to the user. It's being done a little bit. They call it toilet to tap, which is a really, really bad slogan.
Very bad.
But it's being done a little bit, but it's very expensive because you got to repipe everything. You got to dig all new trenches and everything. So the easier solution is, well, let's say I'm a brewery. I've got a bunch of, it takes 7 to 8 liters of water to make 1 liter of beer. Okay. So I got a bunch of excess water. If I treat it on site, I can reuse it on site. And even without making beer with it, I can reuse 50% of it for process uses. And so now, because I have the water, I can reuse it. And it's also going to reduce my water bill because I keep reusing the stuff I have already. So businesses like the model because, number one, there's another terrible thing going on, which is that water and sewage rates are inflating faster now than college tuition is. Because of this underfunding problem, utilities are trying to charge the end users. And now you have a lot of poor people who are being cut off. And now they have to buy bottled water, which is even worse. So It's a vicious cycle that's going on with water rates. So if a business starts doing its own, well, now they have control over their costs because it's the cost of running the plant, and they can recycle, which reduces the incoming water price. And thirdly, it's actually a factor we found, they are not dealing with the politics of that water utility. They have their own, as long as they meet permit requirements, they're left alone. And they actually like that because the water utility is a political animal and they try and do things to favor certain, Nestle or whatever. And so there's a lot of politics going on with the utility, whereas this business on its own can just do its own thing. And that's very attractive.
So, it's interesting you say that the high water and sewage rates. I think everything is having high inflation right now, even though it's not necessarily reflected in the inflation rate, which is interesting. So how does it work for individuals, right? Because if you're talking about the recycling water, some of the biggest users of water are farms. Let's start there, right? So you got a farm that's using a massive amount of water, and you see California. They said nobody can take showers, but the farms can do whatever they want, right? Which makes sense, right? It's business, and you can't not water the goods, or you're gonna have problems. But the problem is also you have huge runoff, and there's water problems in farms. Is that a problem you can solve too, or is it just more on the retail or industrial level?
Well, as you're absolutely right. First of all, 90% of all water demand is by industry and agriculture. And that's true across the world, but the ratios between industry and agriculture vary. In America, it's roughly 50-50. In Somalia, it's 90% agriculture, right? So depending how industrialized the country is how much the water use will be by industry. But in this country, it's roughly half and half. Now, which means that only 10% of the use is by regular humans, which kind of makes it laughable that they're telling us to take shorter showers in California because it doesn't have that much of a net effect. I think we all should be water mindful, of course, but the real action is with industry and agriculture. And focusing on agriculture, I have to say that there's been some good progress. California practices have improved, mainly because water costs money, and it's costing more and more. Local water districts are charging more for water. And so agriculture is trying to reuse and so forth. The problem is that the choice of crops is very water intensive. Avocados, rice, things that are just, you should grow them in Mississippi, right? Don't grow them in the desert. In the desert, you should grow barley and hemp, but that isn't priced. And it's a $9 billion market in California, and it's got all the lobbyists in Sacramento, and they want to keep doing expensive crops. It's not their fault; it's the market, right? So we're stuck with a model in California where the crop mix is to the premium, which means lots of water use. Also, cattle uses a vast amount of water. Again, we should. Every time I drove north on the I-5, I'd go past those stockyards and stinky. But there's a lot of cattle, husbandry going on in or stockyards and so forth in California. And again, it's a big water use. So I think overall, the first step is to push more recycling. The second one is, unfortunately, I think the districts are going to have to penalize the more expensive crops more. That's going to be a very hard idea to swallow. But over time, we can be, if you're in a desert, do what's right for the desert kind of idea.
Yeah. So you said Israel recycles 90% of their water. How do they do it? Like, what's their method of getting around this? We're only doing 1%.
Well, first of all, they built their plant later, right? It's just like our energy grid here is ancient and only goes one way, whereas newer energy grids have two-way communication and so forth. Africa never built landlines; they just went straight to cell phones. So newer generation stuff is more efficient. Secondly, they have a command economy, right? The the Israeli government is absolutely in charge. They have a democracy, but they're able to mandate certain things to happen. And one thing that they've done that we have not done in the States is implemented recycling on a broad level. We could do it, but there's no a priority for it. And here's an additional factor that's going on. As you know, there's a lot of reshoring going on where we're bringing industry back to America, which is a good thing. And these factories will be AI factories, very modern, very few people involved, very efficient. But already, South Texas and North Mexico are experiencing, labor shortages and warehouse space shortages and so forth. I understand in Tijuana, for example, it's 1 million square feet of factory and office space, factory and warehouse space that just isn't being met. So what's going to happen is a lot of factories showing up, and they'll just have to have their own water treatment because there's not enough sewage being built, not enough facilities being built. And I suspect they'll also have to be self-sufficient for energy, right? Well, why not? I mean, what is this need for a centralized model? Why not just be decentralized? It worked great when we made from mainframes to PCs, and mainframes were more efficient from the mainframe point of view. A PC is idle, 12 hours a day, but it's there when you need it. Whereas the mainframes, I grew up when you had to queue up for mainframes. When I was in high school, we had to book time on the mainframe. So the mainframe was king. Today, the PC is king. The idea is to do the same thing with water, not let the municipality be king, but let the user determine their own fate. It's healthier. It's going to result in better water use. And ultimately, what it'll do is unburden the city utilities to serve people better. In Ireland, water is free. But why isn't it free here? Well, it's because industry and agriculture are just completely, burdening the system. Pull them off, they're happy, and now the municipalities can actually serve people individually.
So, I mean, we talked about a number of issues. What other issues exist in the water industry right now?
Okay, so if you go to the Environmental Working Group, ewg.org, ewg.org/tapwater, and put in your zip code, you will find out the quality of the water in your zip. And it's always compliant. Utilities do a good job of complying with the law, but the law is decades behind. And on that page, it'll say, okay, here's the requirement by law, and here's the requirement that science has found. And it's, 200%, 2,000% over. And so what we have a problem really is that the incoming tap water has got a lot of toxins in it. It's got those forever chemicals. It's got industrial toxins, and increasingly you have to purify water. Now, we don't do a lot of water purification projects, but we have a very high-end hotel chain that decided to purify all its incoming water at all of its hotels, not just have that bottle on the dresser when you walk in the room, but everywhere, the kitchen, the shower, all of it. And that's very smart. And so it's beautiful water that we're treating, and it's not that expensive. The entire hotel, I think it's less than $100,000 for them to just take care of it. So it's a smart thing, and we're going to see more and more of that. And of course, in people's homes, they need to be aware of that problem and at least have that Brita pitcher on the counter, at the very least. But there's things you can do. The problem is that to do them really well takes money.
What have you found to be the best ways for consumers to purify water or filter or whatever method is?
Well, what I did when we moved into this condo in 21, we initially I was thinking, okay, we're going to do a whole home reverse osmosis water system. Reverse osmosis is basically a way to squeeze out all the impurities, all of it. It completely takes care of everything, but it's energy intensive and it's expensive. What we decided instead was, with advice from our local water company, was to put in place what's called ultrafiltration throughout the condo, which takes you down to, I think, 0.2 microns. And then the kitchen tap, put a reverse osmosis. So our drinking water is, well, when you do reverse osmosis, you have to clean it, then you have to remineralize it. So that's all properly done under our sink, and we have the nice water. And the third thing we did, can't forget that, is to put shower nozzles that have filters that go way below that 0.2, because and the biggest threat in that area of super small particles is glyphosate, which is called Roundup, branded Roundup. Glyphosate is very toxic, and it does not leave your body. Farmers that farm with glyphosate come down with brain cancer. It's a very nasty toxin, and it's in our water supply. We all have some degree of glyphosate. And so my MD actually said, go buy, I think it's Pro One, I think, on Amazon, but it was a shower head with a filter. I replace it once a year, and my shower water is free of this glyphosate. So those are three things: ultrafiltration, which is just a big old filter in your utility closet, the under sink reverse osmosis, and the shower heads.
So you mentioned remineralization, and that's something I read years ago about. The reverse osmosis pulls all the minerals out. So how do you remineralize it? I hadn't seen anything about that.
Right. So there's you can buy these modules. Basically, they use things like coral, dead coral, which is a source of calcium carbonate, and so you just run the water through the medium, the mineral medium, and it remineralizes it. Then you can also, if you like, you can do a high pH if you want that. Some people think it's important, some people don't. But for sure, you want to put the minerals back in your water. And even so, I don't water my plants with that purified water. I use the tap water for my plants because it's got the original minerals in it. Whatever cocktail of microminerals is in the original tap water is good for my plants. So every single provider of under sink system or whole home systems will give you a remineralization stage.
Okay, cool. So let me ask you before we wrap it up here, what are the biggest impediments in getting a lot of this implemented into municipalities or on a local level? What are the barriers? Why aren't people just doing this?
Well, the solution is to bypass the municipality. In other words, leave the municipality alone. They don't have the means, and they're trying hard. And by the way, they love it when businesses start doing their own stuff. They're perfectly happy to see that. Let them do their thing, and just implement more and more of this treat in place strategy. And what we had to confront starting in 2020 with COVID and so forth was, how are businesses going to get the capital to do this? And that's when we implemented something that's a lot like the master limited partnerships you see in the oil industry, where regular investors can invest in a basket of energy properties. And we just copied that for the water thing. So that's been very popular. People like the idea of doing an oil well thing, but it's water, right? They think that's super cool. And so this is very popular. We call it water on demand. And there's, as I say, we're not the only player out there, but we tend to be focused on the mid-market as opposed to the high end. The high end is easy sales, but in the aggregate, the middle class of anything is many, many, many more units than the upper class. And also being funded not by private equity, but by regular investors. And that's kind of our thing. And we love doing it. We think that the way to make it explode is, in George Bush's words, 1,000 points of light, right? Just do a lot of it everywhere. And that's kind of the solution, both here and internationally.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, Riggs, I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your wisdom with us. Where can people find more about you?
Well, very simple. They can go to originclear.com. We run a weekly Zoom briefing. We've done so since early 2020. And every Thursday night, I try and tell people everything about what's happening with water, the economics, and our news. And so they'll get invited to do that when they go to richardclear.com. If they're interested in investing, right now we only take accredited investors, but we occasionally do crowdfundings with unaccredited investors. And there's a handy green invest now button. I wonder why it's green. But anyway, there it is.
Great. Well, Riggs, we really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your wisdom with us about this really interesting topic. I look forward to having you in the future.
Well, especially since I think that, it's going to be counted in months. Now, I want to make the darn thing explode the way we made the internet explode. How about that?
Sounds like a great idea.
Thank you, Kirk.
All right. Thanks a lot, Riggs.
It's a pleasure.
Hey, Doug, did you hear? We're giving away free money. Well, I'll tell you about it in a minute, but before I do, there's a saying in the mining community, well, precious metals mining, that is. The saying is that if you want the best deals, you have to be in the room. Now, you're probably thinking, what does it mean to be in the room? Well, I'll tell you. Being in the room means that you're on the short list of people who get invited to be a part of the best deals. These are the deals that most investors will never have access to. You mean like IPOs? Nope, IPOs are chump change. Those are for retail investors, small potatoes. That's nothing compared to these deals. These deals would have you salivating to get access to them. Once you know they exist, you will never look at investing the same way again. I almost don't want to even tell you that they exist because it will ruin your thinking of how the investing world really works. Now, you might be excited that these deals exist, but you only have access to the deals if you're an insider, or in the room as they call it. Now, as loyal listeners to the show, I'm going to give you a chance to be in the room. Money Tree Investing Podcast has created the Insiders Club. This is a community of our show's members who are loyal listeners of the show and want to get more out of their investing experience. Being a part of the Insiders Club gives you insider status for upcoming events and webinars, discounts, free stuff and books, and influence on the future direction of the show. This is a great opportunity to join us as we expand our content and services. Oh, and did I mention free money? Yes, in the next few weeks, I'll be giving away free money to our members of the Insiders Club as my appreciation for listening to the show. Now, there's no cost to join the Insiders Club. Just go to moneytreepodcast.com/free money today to join the community. That's www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money. I hope to see you in the room.
All right. Well, that was a great interview with Riggs. Really appreciate him coming on the show. Now we're into the panel portion of the show where you have our very own Doug Hagerin. Hey, Doug.
Hey, Kirk, good morning. I'm looking forward to blowing this up like the Cuyahoga River back in 1969, since we're talking about water here.
Awesome. And we have our very own Barb Freeberg. Hey, Barb.
Hey, perfect timing. I just put in a reverse osmosis system under my sink. So finally, I will have clean drinking water too.
Awesome. Well, I'm drinking my own water right here out of my mason jar like I do every week. And
Me too, Kirk. There's a little left. It's polluted though.
Oh, well, good.
But by coffee beans.
It's a good thing. It's a good thing your body will filter that out, Doug.
That's right.
So the rest of us can have clean water. All right. So Doug, what were some of your takeaways from the interview?
So I thought it was interesting. Yeah, somehow you started on a conversation about taxes and audits, which I found very interesting. And there's some really, really interesting tidbits about who's getting audited. He talked about the poor. About 50% of all audits go to people making less than $25,000 because of tax breaks that they claim for like extra children. Actually, I'm sorry, he didn't exactly go into that, but he talked about the poor having more children, which I thought was ironic because that's exactly why they get audited. So it reminded me of all of these extra claims there. And then, of course, it segued into the main point, which is water. And it made me think of a lot of things. It made me think, again, there's money to be made on it. So I'm always suspicious of what people are selling. This day and age, as a comedian, I think it was a comedian that I heard that talked about, back in the day, it was snake oil. Today, it's essential oil, or it's water, or it's whatever that new fat is. But it also made me think of the reality of the fact that water is an essential substance for life. And unfortunately, we've taken some. I often wonder if I could go back 500 years and just live in the world then, what it would be like, trees and clean water and all that. You look at it now after the post-industrial revolution, we've got issues with PFAS in our well water where I live. You've got pollution and sewage issues all over the world. It's unfortunate that we paid to trash the water, and now they're selling to pay to clean the water. And there's this balance there that's just, there's so many different things that we can, that come from, that stem from this. I love what he's doing. I love, because there's a need to clean water, there's a need of ways of looking at ways to economize it. But at the same time, we shouldn't have to be doing this in the first place.
Yeah, I totally agree. I wish things were that simple. So Barb, what are some of your takeaways from the interview?
I like what Doug said. And I think a problem with the entire industry is we don't know anything. Most people are totally, myself included, are totally ignorant on this entire water issue. Sure, I've heard, especially when I traveled in Israel, desalination plants. Well, that's awesome. That sounds amazing. Why don't we have those here? I'm in California where like half the year we have no water at all. Or why don't we have these other systems? I thought the toilet to sink or whatever was like, I've heard of that, and all I can think when I hear of that is, oh, that's so disgusting. I can't bear the idea of it. But I believe underneath it there's some merit to that sort of thing. So the question remains, is there an investment here for us? And how do we learn more? And then how do we keep ourselves safe?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I personally been fascinated by this since, like, I think it was 97, 96, when I was, the summer before I was entering in college. There was this company called Equinox, and it was a multi-level marketing company, just to be clear, or network marketing is what they call it now, because that's different from multi-level marketing. But anyway, so this company, they had that business model, and I knew about those things, but I was just curious. I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. Maybe I can learn sales. And that's how I was thinking about it, because they had a good sales training. I thought overall the product was pretty good. They ended up going bankrupt years later, and there was some shenanigans going on. But basically, I thought the concept was interesting because they were really focused. Their first product was water filtration. And so I learned a lot about this then through this, because I was reading through their stuff and talking to them. And of course, there's some questionable data there because it's a network marketing company. But generally speaking, it was I learned a lot about water filtration. And they had some great articles at the time. They were written, difference between reverse osmosis, carbon filters, and it kind of went through all these different things. So I actually had a good education on this. And so, I had, and I don't know, this is back in 96, and I'm sure technology's changed a little bit, but there was but it was really interesting to kind of figure out, like, okay, this is really important. And, and part of the sales things that they taught us was like, yeah, use this chlorine, I think it was chlorine dropper. And if you put chlorine, if you drop it into water and there's chlorine in there, it will turn yellow. I was like, oh, that's really cool. So I tried it in a few faucets. And I'm like, holy crap. Like, it wasn't a gimmick. It was like literally something you buy out of a store. And it's just like your pool, and you test the chlorine. I'm like, wow, this is pretty high. So it gave me some really good insight into the concept of water and the value of it. And then, of course, you have the Mike Burry comment after The Big Short, and they have that at the end of the movie, and he's like, oh, Mike Burry is doing all this, and this, and now he's into another commodity like water. And I remember hearing an interview about him talking about it, and what I guess he was doing was buying like date farms, because dates require an enormous amount of water. So you have to have like a water supply. So if we are really running out of water, right, then then the value is owning land that has water attached to it. The question is whether that will stick if we really do have water problems. Are they going to allow you to retain that water in property rights? I would argue that, that could be questionable given our governmental tactics in the last 20 years. But
But yeah, I mean, what you know, I mean, Doug, I know you know a lot about this. So what kind of where do you think the opportunities are? I mean, it's great. We can invest in water, but what do you invest in? Like this is kind of there's so many different, you know, pathways we could talk about here, but where do you see opportunities?
That's a great question. By the way, I want to say that I actually had family members that sold Equinox. I actually have an Equinox filter that was just been hanging out in a box somewhere. So yeah, I'm familiar with. You threw that out there. It's like, wow, blast from the past,
I got a
crazy.
few of those still, Doug. They're sitting in my basement.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yep. Exactly. Getting great use, I see. You know, where is the opportunity? And that's the real tough thing. You know, you were talking about the governments. When I was in Colorado, one of the things that they have is that all water is considered public utility. So it's unless you were grandfathered in, you cannot have a water capture system on your property. Anything that falls from the sky is deemed to be public and allowed to then, you know, absorb into the ground, pass through through ground filtration into the waterways. You can't hoard it. And I think that is something that is going to be a significant increasing area that regulators are probably going to look at if they look at rights. I think that one of the things that if you're going to look at investments, and again, most of this stuff, unfortunately, you talked about Equinox going out of business, right? Most of this stuff, unfortunately, is going to be something that is going to be more speculative and high risk, because in some ways, this is very much like the .com evolution. We know that there's water, right, issues. We know that we need clean water. I've seen a number of different nonprofits and organizations out there doing different things to clean out water. You know, I know, Barb, you were talking about toilet to to faucet, right? I mean, we have a septic system. The septic system goes through multiple tanks. You know, the people that run these, that build these say, you know, by the time it gets the third tank, you could drink it. I was like, no, thank you. I'm sure that sounds wonderful, and I possibly could without dying, but it's not quite there yet, right? But in some ways, if you think about it, all water that we drink was toilet to faucet. Okay, every single drop of water on this entire planet has cycled through an animal and a plant multiple times, millions of times in the history of the world. So that's, I mean, the earth is great at filtering these things out. The issues are going to be, again, who's going to be the big player? So obviously, Riggs has a strategy here that, when it comes to self-contained filtration systems, there is certainly an argument that could be an investment opportunity. And I think people are going to take more accountability for filtering their own water and recycling it. And it is so expensive to obtain. It is extremely expensive to get land with access to water, to pump it, to then just basically use this as a one-use system, right? That's what we do. It's a throwaway. It's water. We treat water the same way we treat plastic. Ironic that the two things are now emulsified together, and we've got that problem too. So things like, Barb, you talked about desalination in Israel. Extremely inefficient system that has been incredibly costly. That's why we have not seen it implemented, because the amount of energy that it takes in order to create enough heat because that's what you're basically looking at, the byproduct. And all of a sudden you've got, you're trying to evaporate these systems, or you're doing it through filtration. I think, well, some of the things that are going to be investment, is going to be groups that not necessarily like Riggs, but there are entities out there that are going, and they're investing in ownership of water. Okay. And unfortunately, whether or not you think that's ethically sound or not, that's up to you. But there are groups that are acquiring more and more water rights. That certainly would be a potentially strong investment, because as we struggle to get more clean water, as we struggle to get water at all, especially you mentioned dates or almonds and avocados, some of them, unfortunately, they don't retain water. These are some of the driest foods out there because they take the water and it evaporates right out. So, as we are struggling to get more water, those that have, unfortunately, access to clean water, the economics to be able to filter it, and retain it, and unfortunately sell it. And it is becoming less and less about a public domain. We are, although I think municipalities are working on that and want to retain those rights, the private ownership of water has become, unfortunately, go back 30, 40 years, bottled water wasn't a big thing. It is now a part of life, unfortunately. Look at the people selling the aluminum water bottles and the drinking water. I think that's going to be huge. And I also think that filtration systems that clean out impurities are going to be a very valuable investment. Again, these are all speculative investments. I don't know who's going to be strong, but in my area, PFAS, this was the main building block component of Teflon. And unfortunately, the companies that manufactured just dumped it into the soil. They sent it to the dumps. Now it's leaching into the water systems. This is not filtered out by your Brita system. There are you have to look at reverse osmosis. You have to look at carbon granular filtration systems that are specifically designed with such nano filtration to get that stuff out. And I think those are some of the areas that I would look at as just a starting point, as ways in which you can invest in how we're going to get our water, because I think the transmission part of it is going to be critical.
Yeah, that's some great points, Doug. Barb, what about you? What are some of your thoughts on opportunities there?
Well, there are ways to invest in water. And let me give a disclosure, because I'm not much of a sector investor. In other words, I typically buy, the total market index, total international market index, because it's an easy way to invest and has proven to deliver decent results. But if you're a sector investor or a stock picker and you think water looks interesting, there are places you can go. There are water stocks out there that, like Doug said, you can invest in, like bottled water companies. You can invest in water filtration companies. Those type of individual stocks will give you access to components of the water industry. But what if you're a fund investor? You don't want to go around stock picking and suffer the risk that the company you picked is going to have a bad quarter and your price is going to drop or fall precipitously. So if you want to go for ETFs, there are several that are targeted. For example, the Invesco Water Resource Portfolio, ticker symbol PHO, is the largest US-centric basket of 38 holdings that tilts toward mid and smaller cap water companies. So if you want to put a portion of your portfolio in that to try and capture the water industry, that's an opportunity. Now, if you want to go a little broader, we've got the iShares US Utilities. And again, we're not recommending any of these. I'm not a financial advisor, so I'm not telling you what to invest in, but I'm telling you these are available. The iShares US Utilities, IDU, gives you some exposure to water-related stocks, but also other utilities. Other alternatives include the Invesco Global Water Portfolio, PIO, which tracks the NASDAQ OMX Global Water Index. So if you want to try and dip your toes into the water, figuratively speaking, there are places to do that.
Yeah,
Great.
Barb, I want to add, there's also some mutual funds out there, and I know those aren't as exciting as they used to be as the ETF world has come in, but without naming any specific names, there are some specific companies that got into this early and created funds specifically around water. Again, I think one of the things that they have the advantage of, and there are sometimes that active is a little bit better than passive, because especially something as speculative as this, there's a lot, like I said, there's a lot of things that can change. Who's behind the water? What are they using to track? So I've actually looked, and some of the funds out there have actually performed much better than some of the ETFs that are active. But what I will say is that since this really, if you go back on the investment history of some of these ETF mutual funds, it goes back to basically the late aughts, early or to 2010s. It's about as far back as it goes. Now, some of this, we love to talk about correlation and causation, some of this could be correlated to general overall market performance, but some of this could also be correlated to the increasing focus on water. That over that course of time, it has been a steady increase in the valuation of many of these holdings. So, just looking at one I'm looking at here, it's about 200 to 300% over the last 10 years. So, so that's, that is something that if you take a look at that, it's like 30% a year. I mean, there is definitely investment going in this. As an individual investor, again, maybe something like what Riggs is putting out there where you can get in and you have it, you can, I don't know how the access is. I didn't look at how to be a part of the investment group there, but I would be very cautious putting something in. So if you want to dip your toe into it, there are ways that you can get into it without being someone that has to spend your days and nights watching it so closely, and that you're making sure that your investment doesn't evaporate. Somebody else will watch it for you through the means of some of these investments.
Yeah, no pun intended, I'm sure, Doug. So, yeah. So,
Kirk, always a little bit.
Always something in there. Always something. Yeah. So, I mean, what I find interesting is thinking about like water as an investment. It's like thinking about air as an investment, right? Like if you have water, there's enough of it. It's just a matter of how to access it, right? The oceans, 70% of the planet is covered with water. So, having enough water is not the issue. Is having enough of accessible water is certainly is. So it's interesting, you look at something like air, like, well, it's how do you deal with cleaning up the air quality, right? Like whether it's filters or whether it's working with power plants and lessening that, so there's a lot of investments when it comes to air, but you can't invest in the air itself. Now, water you can, but it also kind of brings up some other issues, which, I think about like Mike Burry's comment about he's investing in water, and he primarily does it through, buying date farms. And there's some other farmers. We had some on the show where they talk about it's really having enough water. If anyone ever watched the show Yellowstone, there was a thing there where they basically blew up the river, so they cut off the guy's water, and the guy just he had no value anymore. And I know that's a big thing out in Montana, or having access to water for your cattle is a big deal. So, there's some huge implications, plus the fact that, you've got these big rivers. I think it's the Colorado River that kind of runs through the West, that when you start at the top and it runs basically south, all these states are pulling from that water supply. And then when you get to the bottom, it's a lot less. And similarly, some other place in the country as well is that everyone's trying to pull their water from the river, but the more people we have, the more they're pulling, and then the river dries up, and now all of a sudden you got bigger problems. So, I think that, a problem this big tends not to be solved because the politicians are like, well, that sounds really expensive. I want to get reelected, so I'm just going to let the next guy or gal deal with that. And obviously that's short-sighted, and it's like dealing with their infrastructure in this country. Well, not enough bridges collapsed this year, so no one's really going to be interested in spending money on the infrastructure. So we'll just wait. We'll wait till there's a big bailout or something. We can dip our fingers in the till and they can work on it then. We don't think about things constructively. Like you look at a place like China, and they have the fortune of not having prior infrastructure to rebuild over, which we do. So if you just had like vast like plots of land with nothing on it, you can build whatever you want, right? Because there's nothing you have to destroy to create something new. So they're able to create some magical infrastructure over there that we don't have, in large part because it started from scratch. So we have this legacy system in place, good or bad, it's what we have. Can you imagine trying to rip up all the pipes all over the country to replace it with something new? It's like replacing copper with fiber, right? For the telecom industry. Like, it's expensive. It's taken them decades to do that. So if you think about water, like there's different aspects. Do you deal with filtration? Do you deal with like just the infrastructure of how to get it there? Like all these different aspects are important. But the thing that's always fascinated me is desalinization. And I know maybe the technology is not there in the way that we would need it to be, but to me, it seems like that's an obvious one. We're trying to fight over the rivers and the streams, and you got this huge ocean of water that we could easily pull from.
why can't we figure out how to make that work better? To me, that seems like, and it may not be the low-hanging fruit in terms of technology, but it's low-hanging fruit in terms of supply. And if you can solve that problem, well, now all of a sudden, I think you've got something. Now, the high energy issue with desalinization, I don't know. Let's brainstorm in this podcast. Let's innovate. How about you put a nuclear power plant right next to the desalinization plant, and now you have clean air and clean water all at the same time? How about that? Like no one's coming out with that product, although they do have nuclear reactors that are contained and small enough that you could put deep in the ground, and they run out of fuel in like 10 years. How about that? Like, there's so many different things that people, I'm sure it's just government red tape galore trying to do these things. But to me, it seems like there's got to be some way to solve these problems that doesn't require 10 degrees from MIT. So maybe it's me. Maybe the problem's not urgent enough, which is, think of global warming or climate change or whatever they want to call it today. Like, that's a big thing because we made it a big thing. Is it destroying the planet tomorrow? No. Despite what Al Gore said, it's still here and hasn't changed much. Is it a problem? Sure, pollution's a big problem. But, like, it became a problem because we made it a problem. And is water a big enough problem? Apparently not, because we're not making it a problem. And I mean, that's how infrastructure projects get done, right? Is it big enough? Is it important enough? Is the timeline, does it need to happen in a certain period of time? So things tend to happen when they're urgent enough, unfortunately. But hopefully private industry can come up with a solution that doesn't require the government, because we know how long that'll take. So Barb, what are some other thoughts you have here? Because I think, if you listen to the interview, it seems like there's tons of opportunity, but there's also a lot of snake oil, if you will. So
Exactly.
So how do people navigate that?
And I think it always gets down, and you guys have heard me say this a million times. It always gets down to, first, you start at the top with, what are your investment goals? Having an investment plan, creating an appropriate portfolio for you, for your age, for your timeline, for your risk tolerance. And then I have a 5% kind of discretionary portion of my investments that I go into and try things I like, or I hear about something that sounds good. And sometimes it's a winner and sometimes it's a loser, but it's a way that I can be a little active. Now, I'm not talking to you right now, all you active investment managers, but talking to most of us out here who want just a clear kind of set it and forget it type of portfolio. But if you have a portion of discretionary kind of investment capital that you've allocated, then you can get creative. If you think water is in a good situation, well, invest in an ETF or consider a private investment. But realize, whenever you get off the public markets, there is the promise of higher returns, but the negatives are there is much less regulation, there's much more speculation, there's much greater risk. And a lot of your investments are dependent on the manager of that private investor. And so that's an opportunity for those of you that are more risk seeking, that want to strive to go for that home run at the risk of striking out.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was just thinking about something as you're talking, Barb. Like, the one aspect that we don't have is water doesn't have a price. Like, there's technically there is if you want to buy a bottle of water, but it doesn't really have a price. Like, when you put a price to something, now you've got economics to it, and now you can actually create economic benefit for people solving problems. And maybe the part of the problem is there's not enough incentive for people to solve it. There's incentive for people to smell snake oil. I mean, like I said, I was part of Equinox for a few months, and there's plenty of snake oil there. I think some of the products are actually pretty good, but there's also some questionable stuff too. And it makes me wonder, like, there's always gonna be people like that.
right? That are going to come up and be like, oh, we're going to solve this problem and pollution's going to kill you tomorrow. And you got to drink clean water. You got to use glass and all these things make sense, right? Like plastic leaching in the water is bad and all these things. Totally, totally agree. But, it's basically sold by fear as opposed to sold by need, right? And I imagine if the economics are such that it makes sense for companies to find a solution, they will. But if you're just finding another way to scare the pants off people by coming up with like, reverse osmosis versus carbon filter versus I forget all the different types. There's like 4 or 5 different types. And they all have good and bad parts. But the point is most of the public doesn't realize any of this. And so rather than scaring the pants off everybody, I wonder if there's a way to create economic benefit for people to actually solve the problem that doesn't include fear. It includes actual economics. Because the bottled water is getting more expensive. I'm pretty sure it doesn't cost them anymore to pull it out of the ground. My bottled water, my gallon water used to be like $1, used to be 25 cents or whatever it was as a kid, and now it's probably $2 a gallon. Like, is it going up in price? Probably not. But they're charging more. Certainly the plastic hasn't gotten any better. The water hasn't changed. So, it's their infrastructure. They got to pay for their people. And I'm sure there's a bunch of profit built in there as well. But I think we always have to think about like, how do we find a solution that is solving a problem as opposed to addressing somebody's fear? Because fear is a great motivator to sell. It's a great motivator to buy. But, is fear the best overall good? Probably not. But it's just human nature. So people just have to realize that. So think about like how you can invest in things that's not based on fear, but based on, solving an actual problem that's meaningful to you. So let's, in the interest of time, we're going to wrap it up here, Doug. So final thoughts from you, Doug. Where can people find more about you?
Thanks, Kirk. Yeah. So final thoughts from me. I was just kind of taking a quick look here. And you talked about all the different things that are out there. There's basically three main. I mean, there's only 1.2% of the entire world's water is drinkable. Right. So there's right about 2.5% is fresh water, but the majority of that water is locked up in glaciers, ice caps, permafrost. We want to get on a real political conversation. We can sit there and just say, let's wait a couple of years and it'll all melt and we'll have it available to us. I think, but the other thing is the different types of filtrations and systems that are out there. I mean, when you hear something goes viral and it's creating that fear, striking that fear, like alkaline water, right? I think that's a big one right now. As first it was drink fresh water, don't drink the city water. Now it's make sure the only water you get is alkaline water, because that's better for you. You're not getting enough minerals, leaching this, leaching out. Listen, this is just a tidbit, but I read somewhere, not to gross everybody out, but Papua New Guinea, one of the last places of cannibalism in the world, they said Americans are disgusting. Why are they disgusting? They're too salty and greasy, okay? We don't have a problem with not getting enough minerals. Half our food is laden with sodium, right? So it's probably good for us to leach out a few of those minerals and get ourselves back to a better balance of hydration. Okay? The thing is, there's the main investment in the world. So there's companies like Colligan. They're private. Okay, there's a lot of private companies out there that are addressing this. It can be very hard to get into the investments. There's the indexes, or the ETFs. There's the mutual funds. There's the main biggest companies in water filtration that are out there publicly are all part of major global holdings. For example, like Ecolab out of Minnesota has got a division that they bought. So again, if you take a look, a lot of the water investment is going to be multinational, multi-conglomerate companies. GE used to be involved with it, but they sold out. So I think these are ways that you can tackle this. I mean, we do have sewage problems. We do have pollution problems. That's not a question. And we do have an issue with salinity. And there's going to be ways to do it. But the problem, Kirk, is going to be economics. It is extremely expensive to build the infrastructure to go through and do this stuff. And that's why a lot of the money that's going to be there, it's going to be the same, group of global, highly capitalized companies that are going to go after this. Totally unrelated to this, can't even connect it. But if you want to, but a lot of you that might be listening have kids in high school. You don't want to talk about uncapped, unaffordable. Let's talk about college for a second. Let's just say this. Colleges are there to do what? Again, the snake oil. They're trying to get more money out of you than they're going to give back to you in a return on investment. If you'd like to even that playing field, get the information that you need to be able to be a smart shopper, go to our website, procollegeplanners.com, get the checklist, get the basic information, or download our free CAP report and find out what the colleges think you can afford and where you can get the discounts right now. procollegeplanners.com.
Great. Well, Doug, appreciate you coming on the show. And sounds like I know where I'm going on my next vacation. Go visit the cannibals, because I'm not going to worry about them eating me because I think I'm too salty and greasy. So I should be safe. All right. Well, Barb, final thoughts from you.
I am Barbara Friedberg. You can find me at Barbara Friedberg Personal Finance. Open to emails, conversations about investing. You can sign up for my free newsletter and tips on investing. See you next time.
Great. Thanks for coming on, Barb.
That's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us on Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name's Kirk Chisholm, Wealth Manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on this show. You can also check out our show at Money Tree Investing Podcast. On our website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Please remember to subscribe on our YouTube channel for immediate access to the new shows when they're released. When you subscribe to the show, it allows us to get access to some of the top minds of investing in personal finance. While you're here, please leave a comment and question if you want us to address it on the show. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.